Okay, everybody, I welcome you back from the lunch break, and I hope you had good conversations. So I have now the pleasure to be the chair for Stefan Lunden. But before that, I would like to apologize for the inconvenience that at some point in Annie Coombs' talk, the slides went away for our online audience. So for the next talk, we will try to make sure that you will see everything for that you can follow the lecture of Stefan Lunden. Yeah, so I now have the pleasure to present you. Dr. Stefan Lunden is a research associate at the Department of Conservation at the University of Gothenburg. His research focuses on how museums deal with objects of violent provenance. His doctoral dissertation, Displaying Loot, the Benin Objects and the British Museum, which came out at the University of Gothenburg 2016, took as a point of departure the British Museum's collection of objects looted in Benin City in 1897. He's currently working on the research project Dealing with Difficult Pasts, a comparative study of Benin exhibitions in Britain, Germany, Nigeria, and the US. In the project, dear Stefan, you study how museums handle so-called difficult cultural heritage that is dark, painful, and controversial aspects of history. You've already published a range of articles on this topic. Today, you will present us some aspects of your study. So, dear Stefan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for this nice introduction. Let's start here with, we got this little thing coming up here on the screen here. Is that possible to do some things on the kommentaranfrage? Can we get rid of that one? It keeps popping up things on the screen. Do it? Or will it disappear if I change the pictures? Or
No, probably won't.
Okay, great. Okay, we will start with some technical problems. But yeah, I'm so delighted to be here in the Humboldt Forum to speak about the topic of difficult heritage. And I mean, this is just the perfect setting to this and to do this among people who know so much about all of these topics. So so I think I will begin with my presentation. And yeah, to begin, the Benin Bronzes, they are, as you know, they are icons of African art and colonial plunder, and they have been in the limelight of the restitution debates. And the main argument for return is that it rights historical wrongs and addresses their present-day legacies, including global inequalities and structural racism. But as to the question of the relation between past and present injustices and their rectifying, and much more broadly, on the question of the past's impact on and relevance for the present, it seems, I think, worthwhile to look beyond restitution and ownership and consider questions regarding the representation of history, which and whose pasts are brought forth or not, when history is narrated through the lens of the Benin Bronzes, and ask crucial questions regarding whether maybe there are other wrongs here which needs righting. Let's see. I'm trying to change the slides here, which doesn't seem to be working very well. I don't know, what do you think? It's not perfect. Is it this one?
It's this one.
This one?
That should work. There you go.
It's that one. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. In this presentation, I will and I will, in the first part of the presentation, analyze the Benin exhibitions in the British Museum and in the National Museum in Benin City. And I will focus on how these museum displays represent difficult heritage, that is, painful and contested aspects of the past. And I will argue that both these exhibitions show a preference for turning their attention to the difficult heritage of others and of neutralizing that of selves. And in the second part of the presentation, I will consider the potentials for new representations, which I think go some way to decenter the oft-repeated narratives focusing on the fortunes of elite men in either British or Edo society. And I will suggest that an intersectional analysis, which not only looks at ethnicity, but also takes gender and class into account, has the potential to illuminate a broader range of past and present injustices. And in developing this perspective I take here in the presentation, I take some inspiration from Gayatri Spivak's article, Righting Wrongs, where she points out that it's obviously a good thing to look at the major wrongs and big atrocities and try to right them through, for example, the prosecution of war criminals, but that we should not lose sight of everyday injustices manifested in, for example, class oppression. So then, first, a few words on difficult heritage. Here, many researchers have pointed out that museums generally avoid, that is, silence difficult heritage. And while this observation is often correct, I think it's also partly dated and needs some qualification. Because today, many museums do strive to include the less glorious side of the past in their narratives. And this shift in representational practice has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. And then here I want to argue that these attempts to bring forth sensitive pasts often works in a tandem with a process of neutralizing them, rendering them rather harmless and meaning that they do little to question historical injustices and their endurances. And I do think that the Benin objects offer an excellent case for a study of the uses of difficult pasts, because these objects, as you can see on this slide here, they are interrelated with some of the darkest facets of human behavior, slavery, colonialism, racism, sexism, and militarism, to name a few. And to briefly exemplify this, and as you've heard before, the metal used to cast these objects for the elite in the Benin Kingdom was brought through the transatlantic slave trade. And as you also probably know, in 1997, they were looted by British troops. And this brute physical violence was interlinked with epistemic violence. In museums displays, they were incorporated into narratives which legitimized dominance over savage peoples. And these objects are also caught up in Europe's own savage history. During the Second World War, as you might know, the collections, or a large part of the Benin collections of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, were looted by the Red Army and later returned to Berlin, not Benin City. So, in short, these objects, they connect with a range of difficult legacies, and therefore I think that comparative analysis of museum displays offer an opportunity to show how painful and sensitive pasts are handled in various local but globally interconnected contexts. And yeah, perhaps the most sensitive legacy linked to the Benin objects is that the fact they were looted in 1897, since this relates to the whole issue of restitution. And while my focus here in this presentation is on representation and not on restitution and ownership, I argue that ownership and representations are deeply enmeshed. Since ownership entails control over representation, and crucially, representations are created to support ownership claims. I'm not suggesting that there is always a causal link between the two, but that an institution's position on the return of colonial loot is generally linked to its view on and characterization of a colonial encounter in its displays. So then we start with the British Museum and how they represent scientific racism. So they do bring up this difficult topic of scientific racism. But as you can see here in these texts, where they discuss this idea about that the Benin Bronzes could not have been of indigenous origin, they do exemplify this with a German scholar, Leo Frobenius. And the British museum scholars are instead, in the writings right up to this day, characterized as enlightened. So, and you saw in the earlier slides exactly how enlightened these British museum scholars were. So, here speaking about the difficult heritage of someone else, in this case the Germans, becomes a way of glorifying the self, in this case the British and the British Museum. Also, I think very interestingly, the historical facts here are distorted. I mean, as you saw, the British museums were not very enlightened. And actually, among the very few who tried to combat stereotypes in their work on the Benin objects were Felix von Luchan at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. And von Luchan, in sharp contrast to the British scholars, stated that the artistic and technical excellence of Benin objects had, in his word, a significant moral importance, since it challenged the present, especially in many of the so-called colonial circles, prevailing disregard for Africans. So to put it short or crudely, the British collected and displayed to prove racial hierarchies, von Luchan to disprove them. So I would say, yeah, this historical representation the British Museum is attempting here is factually very wrong. And we will come back to that a number of times, that things are not presented in ways which agrees with the historical facts. So then, as I said, that perhaps the most difficult aspects of the Benin objects is that they were looted. And I think it's quite interesting to see how this event is displayed in different museums. And it is presented in the British Museum through this tiny photograph here. In the Benin City Museum, it's 3 by 5 meters, and it's a little hard to miss here, as it is here. So there is some kind of difference here. I could also say that if you bother to read the text, the British Museum managed to present this floating thing under the heading, The Discovery of Benin Art by the West. So they do say that the Benin treasures profoundly influenced 20th century art, which again is historically wrong. Picasso and Powis, they were not inspired by any Benin objects. So again, this is invented, giving the whole story of destruction a kind of happy ending, so to speak. How nice that we discovered African art. Yeah. And I don't think you're very surprised if I say that the labels in the Benin City Museum do not hail Westerners for having discovered Western art, etc., etc. The texts in Benin City are instead focused on the destruction brought by the British and on stories of heroic resistance against the British. And also these stories rest on very dubious foundation. So it's not only the British Museum who are sort of maybe not getting the facts right here. And I would say that this way of displaying the colonial encounter is quite typical for the British Museum. They tend to, if they bring up colonialism in their displays, they tend to sort of focus on some kind of positive outcome in the cultural sphere of colonialism. Having said that, one should of course also say that colonialism was a very complex and contradictory process, and it did not only involve the gross violence through military conquest, etc., but also the exercise of soft power and forms of cooperation and exchange between the colonizer and the colonized within the context of unequal power relations. And here again, representations are by necessity selective, and the texts in museum exhibitions are generally short, and no representation can capture the full complexity of colonialism or other historical events. But I think here it's interesting to note that the British Museum, when selecting which aspects of a colonial encounter to represent, they downplay the brute force and put the emphasis on the cooperative aspects of a colonial encounter, or at least until recently. The Black Lives Matter movement, as you know, there was this interesting placard here saying, "Don't like looting, you will hate the British Museum." And as a reaction to that, the British Museum felt that maybe this was a little bit too embarrassing. So they actually made some changes in the British Museum. So there is possible for development also in this institution, it seems. And these included new labels at the bust of Hans Sloane, the British Museum's founder, which did acknowledge that Sloane's wealth, which had enabled his collecting, partly came from his Jamaican slave plantations and from Sloane's investments in slave trading. And in the exhibition, they removed this text and put up another one, where they instead emphasized that the Benin city suffered a violent and devastating occupation with many casualties. And the British Museum text now uses the word looted, which they hadn't done previously. Previously, the preferred term was collected in Benin City, or acquired in Benin City, or my favorite, found in Benin City. One may note that if one looks very closely at the British Museum text in its zeal to emphasize this violence, they do manage to state that the royal palace in Benin City was burnt by the British deliberately. But actually, it wasn't. That was an accident from the British side. So, yeah. I'll just. Yeah. So, I think that this new text here, they do represent a kind of radical break with previous one at the British Museum, but I think one could still say that why did it take so long for the British Museum to come up with this more upfront perspective? And I wouldn't say that the British Museum can hardly be described as being on the forefront of the decolonial work. And it can certainly be argued that changes such as this were only cosmetic and were created to avoid public critique and part of a new strategy to hold on to their precious loot, etc., etc. But I mean, whatever the intentions behind changes like this, and these intentions, I think, are multiple, the effect is that whereas previously colonialism, if it was mentioned at all, was presented to the British Museum's 6 million visitors in a very positive light, now more emphasis is put on colonialism's violent and destructive sides. So maybe there is some positive development here. So now, having sort of bashed the British Museum for a while, let's go to the Benin City Museum, to another extremely sensitive heritage, and that, or another sensitive topic, and that is that of human sacrifices in Benin society. And these sacrifices are a very sensitive topic for two reasons, basically, because they are both a historical reality and a topic of a British propaganda. The existence of these sacrifices was a cornerstone in the British justification for colonial conquest. So then it's interesting to see how are these events then represented in these two museums. In the Benin City Museums, these killings are actually given quite a visual prominence, but I would say they are also neutralized. As you can see here, we got the execution sword for decapitating criminals. And here it's maybe hard to see. Got a figure here with a decapitated head, sword here, figure lying on its back here, feet here, and arms tied. There's a double figure here with swords and decapitated heads. And as you can see on the texts here, they say that this is for executing criminals, and this is the Benin judicial practice. And I think that you also agree with me that sacrifice and executions have very different connotations.
Die Baerbock war natürlich nicht sehr geschickt, ja.
Was war die?
Nicht sehr geschickt.
Someone is
Die kann
talking.
ja als Außenministerin nicht
Ja, ja.
den Premierminister.
Ja, die hat ihre Wähler.
Interesting. Yeah.
Sie redet nur in ihrer Rede. Das
Ja,
ist
ja.
wahr.
I didn't get it really, but I don't know, was it? I don't know. Okay, I'll continue on this. So, yeah, sacrifice and execution, they have very different connotations. And a human sacrifice, that places the taking of lives in the realm of a religion and ritual, and it implies that those killed were innocent people. The concept execution instead places the killings in the realm of justice and law, and that the killings are retribution meted out for crimes committed. If you go to the British Museum and compare, they do not display any of the objects they have which depict human sacrifices, but there is references to it in their texts. And in this case, I would say that the British Museum interpretation seems to be more right than the one in the Benin city. As far as we can say from the source material, it doesn't seem to be that the main purpose of these killings was to punish criminals, or that it was only criminals who were chosen for sacrifice. So again, I think it's easier to speak about someone else's difficult heritage than that of itself. Continuing to more depressing things, slave trade, as we have said earlier as well, that these objects are costs partly from the proceeds of the slave trade, and it is generally the case that the material remains from the past, which have been preserved to this day, are the ones which have belonged to society's upper strata. But if we look at the production of these objects, we encounter those lower down in the social pyramid. And this aspect of objects biographies is not mentioned in either Benin City Museum or in the British Museum. And of course, it brings forth the question of whose stories get told or silenced here, the descendants of the ones who bought the metal used to cast the objects, or the descendants of the ones who were sold to obtain the metal. And of course, similar questions may be asked in relation to the British Museum, whose founding collection was partly bought by the proceeds from slavery and slave trade. So maybe the British Museum in part belongs to the descendants of the people on the Jamaican slave plantations, you might argue. So, but now I will sort of change the topic a little bit from what museums display or not display, but more into the more potentials, the new ways of representing things, topics which are generally not addressed in museum exhibitions. Although I think if you read here, I think you might agree with me that these have very great potential to bring up gender perspectives. The chattering of the native troops is rather astonishing. One would think we're really amongst a lot of women. British men were apparently supposed to talk less than British women. And this kind of stereotypes we have very much with us today, and a stereotype which also serves the fact that in heterosocial settings, exactly the opposite is true. So, and yeah, you can go into and do iconographic analysis and see that there's an interesting man spread here and another one there. So, but let's see what this man over here, what does he have between his legs, so to speak. He does, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but he has this object, which you see here, which is here on display in the Humboldt Forum. And this object, it's an altar group from 1700s showing Oba Eluakbe. And I think this is very telling of Benin social hierarchies. You see the big towering Oba, his small slaves here, and maybe I should. Yes, sorry. And down here, it's a little bit difficult to see maybe, but here you can, there are the slaves with the decapitated heads, or the victims. So, something about Benin social hierarchies. Also, what is a little bit hard to see here is that this figure here is probably a female slave, and that is very unusual in Benin iconography, where the Oba almost always has male slaves. And this aspect, together with that this Oba doesn't have his usual royal regalia, but instead a silly European hat, signifies that this man, this Oba, was deposed and had to live in utter poverty. So that's why he had to do with his silly European hat and a female slave. I mean, poor man, what he must have suffered in this poverty. But he came back to power later on. So, so I think here you can say something about the Benin social inequality. And this is one of the objects whose ownership now has been transferred to Nigeria to rectify historical injustice. And, well, in the beginning I posed this question, but what other wrongs might we want to address here? And I think this altar group again puts the spotlight on this dilemma. And I mean, the servants here, the small servants and the decapitated people, they are not absent in the picture, but the way we tend to look at it is that we tend to forget them and not see them. And I wonder, wherever this altar group will go on display in the near future, in Berlin, Benin City, or elsewhere, would it be possible to try to disrupt its visual and social focus by accompanying it not only with text on social and gender inequality, but maybe also photos which shows these smaller people on a larger scale than the Oba, etc., etc. And maybe if this was what was done, would it then speak to a broader audience, and would it widen the conversation about the wrongs which needs to be addressed and redressed? I can also add to that in a Nigerian context, different forms of slavery and slave owning existed up until 1920s and 1930s. So it's not a very distant past in Nigeria. Of course, having said all this about sort of speaking about difficult Edo pasts, I should also, of course, mention that every representation resonates within a larger landscape of representations and ideas. And it can certainly be countered that an emphasis on Edo inequality and violence fits a very broad range of prejudice about Africans and come very, very close to those 19th century portrayal of Edo barbarity, which justified colonial dominance. Of course, maybe ways of getting around these problems would be to sort of emphasize the more cross-cultural links between different forms of class or gender oppression, maybe. So, from there we should go to, I guess you've been waiting, where will Hamilton's pajamas come up in this story. How is he going to fit that in? I will. I'll put this away. I don't think I'll be running around anymore. So, I mean, as I said, the people who make their appearances in these stories are generally the ones who are placed on the upper levels of their respective societies. And this is a product both of extant source material and, I think, of inherited cultural assumptions about whose lives and fates matter or not, which also affects how we read the documentary records. So the written documents are, you got the similar problems as when reading the iconography of Edo material. But anyway, I think we can, it's possible to look at maybe other objects, in this case pajama suits, and the fate of other people, to get new historical perspectives into focus. And yeah, among the many myths about the Benin Bronzes which circulate is the idea that the loot was sold to defray the cost of the pensions for the killed and wounded in the Benin expedition. That's a myth which is also seen on the in the British Museum, where they say that it was sold to compensate the victims. And again, this story is not true. I think it's one of the stories which was made up to resist restitution. But we do have some evidence in the documentary record about what this sale of a loot was used for. And it did actually compensate some victims. I said earlier that there was a fire which swept through Benin City a few days after the occupation. And the officers, they lost a lot of things in this fire, including whiskey and beer, to a total value of 94 pounds. And this poor man, Bruce Hamilton, who had led the main force against Benin City, he had lost a personal kit for a total of 39 pounds, including an umbrella. Every Englishman brings an umbrella wherever, even if he goes on a punitive expedition, I guess. 2 bath towels, you also need to bring that. And not only one, but actually 2 pajama suits. Poor man, what he must have suffered. But he got compensation from the sale of a loot. This sort of brilliant idea was thought up by someone. We could use the sale of a loot for this one. So. But which victims were not compensated? And as you might know, the immediate cause of this British punitive expedition was that the Edo had earlier attacked a British diplomatic mission to Benin City, killing 7 of the 9 British members and 124 of the about 250 native carriers, servants, and staff. Among the killed were this Harry Powis, a trader of very modest means. And later, it was suggested that a small pension should be provided for the late Powis' aged mother, now without any means of support. The proposal was rejected, and so was an idea of levying a fine on Benin City to be paid to the mother. But I think that this proposal was made and rejected gives us a snapshot of the harsh social realities in a society unable or unwilling to provide the basic means for its most vulnerable citizens. And if a test of a civilization is the way that it cares for its weak and poor, the case, I think, questions the notion of British civilizational superiority. And today, in our neoliberal era of faltering social security systems, one can certainly ask, how much progress have we made since then? There was then another proposal that maybe the 124 native carrier servants and employees killed in this diplomatic should also receive compensation from the protectorate funds. this proposal, it was rejected too, due to the cost. And in that sense, Powis' mother and the relatives of the native participants of the mission, they received equal treatment, or equally bad treatment. And therefore, I think this is something we need to analyze, not only in terms of race, but also class and gender. I mean, why didn't Powis' mother have a pension of her own to start with, etc., etc. So, to sum up, the ones who did receive compensations were the high-ranking officers like Bruce Hamilton, who was compensated for his loss of whiskey and pyjama suits, and the relatives of the ones further down the social hierarchy who had lost their lives were not compensated. So I think, to put it very crudely, in a way, Hamilton's pyjamas mattered more than the lives of Powis and the 124 natives. So I guess what I'm sort of trying to get at here is that the story of the Benin objects is usually told as a story about great art, great men, great wars, but there are other things to say in this context, I think. So then to try to sum up this, whereas this debate on restitution has put the spotlight on some difficult heritage, some enduring wrongs linked to colonialism and racism, other wrongs linked to classism and sexism have not come under equal scrutiny. And a driving force of colonialism was the belief in the division and hierarchization of humanity into different ethnic or racial categories, and such beliefs are very much still with us today. Therefore, obviously, our analyzing has to take this categorization into account. But however, an analysis which only sees, or mainly sees, perceived ethnic categories might at worst serve to reinforce them, and importantly, it loses sight of other ways humans classify and oppress, and how different forms of oppression interact. So I think it may be suggested that an intersectional analysis involving aspects such as class and gender, you could add other aspects as well, could or even should be included in the toolbox for representing difficult pasts and presents. And again, obviously, all representations are partial. No representation can do justice to all past wrongs and their ongoing effects. But precisely for this reason, I think it's important to see how or which stories and perspectives are included, excluded, or neutralized in the production of history, and what this might mean in the present. And I think it's important to try to see as much as possible, as much of this complexity as possible there is need to resist this simplified accounts of history and to strive for seeing as much as possible of its complexity. And I think with these words I will end here and hope you have lots of comments or questions, or you don't need to agree with anything you're saying. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you have other stories, other pyjama suits, or I don't know. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your insightful talk, especially for the intersectional analysis, which is crucial, I think, to this topic. And yeah, I would like to open the floor for questions or commentaries. Are there any?
Just very simple. I was wondering.
Let me give you the microphone.
Yeah, just a simple question, because it also. It does work. Okay. No. Thank you for showing us also another way to deal with it through sarcasm and humor.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you would see that in an exhibition. How to translate this kind of sarcastic and humoristic view into an exhibition.
Oh, I don't know. I think it's a tricky one. I mean, I think it is a very tricky one, and I mean, I would say, I mean, basically today we go for three ways of doing new exhibition. One is to try to get better text, more diverse ones. The other one is sort of include a multiple of perspectives. I think the third one, which is I'm kind of fond of, it's to try to do this meta perspective on representation and try to bring in the aspect of representation. I mean, this is a representation and this is what we do with it. And is this right? Or so, I mean, I mean, as I suggested here, if we got this Oba Wakbe, I mean, one couldn't take one of his image of his sort of decapitated people and blow that up. I mean, that could be a very controversial thing to do, but maybe if one has a text and explains why, etc., one could try to do it. And then, of course, we got all sorts of questions. Who is allowed to speak for whom? I can say I feel a little bit more comfortable when I'm speaking about the British Museum than the museum in Benin City for all sorts of reasons. But I think also when we do get into the class and gender, it's more difficult also to say who should be speaking here. I mean, yeah, so, yeah, some kind of answer, I don't know. But I'm not sure if anything of what I'm aiming at really would work in an exhibition context. I got no idea. So, yeah, but, yeah, no idea. Well, that's the short answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, are there more questions in the room, or is there a question online? You have one?
Yep.
I mean, it goes, so thank you very much, first of all, for your presentation. It goes very much in the direction of what Anna just asked. So as you presented the Benin objects as an excellent case study or a case to study this kind of difficult past, and you highlighted that physical violence interlinked with the, I think you called it epistemic violence, and which was then in a way, to say, preceded in museums, right? So, or like represented in museums.
Yeah.
And is there even like, and there I come back to what Anna asked, is there even like probably the option, or how do you say that? Is there even the possibility to break this legacy in a way? Like, I have no answer to that question, but I would be interested in your opinion on that.
On whether how you can break it with. Well, of course, the legacy, I mean, in a way it's simply when you show these ones from the British Museum and you show these quotes from the curators, it becomes a little bit more complicated when you got von Luchan and his very, we would today say, very anti-racist comments. And how do we want to break that legacy, or do we, I don't know. So, but I mean, I don't know. I guess, I don't know. I'm very much fond of trying to, again, the meta perspectives. We are dealing with representations, and I mean, also if we want to train people in critical thinking and how we view words, I think we can. I mean, sometimes you talk about how these objects have been classified and called certain things and not other things, and so I think that are also aspects one can bring up. So, yeah, so I mean, I think one can work, I mean, as we are now doing, working with these legacies of all sorts of things. And I also, I mean, I need to sort of drift maybe off topic a little bit. I mean, I'm sort of saying again that now I've been speaking about this kind of, we've only been in the human sphere, but inspired by Annie Coombs' talk about all the oil things, and we got the debate on decolonization and decarbonization, which could be, I mean, then you could bring nature into the intersectional analysis as well, and how we are oppressing nature in the past and present and that. So there are endless of possibilities and well, but lots of limits in exhibition texts and that. So, yeah, a bit of rambling on your question, and no answer again, of course. So, yeah. Any more questions I can't answer? I mean,
I think there was one in the digital room. Is that right?
Yes, there was one question by Kavita Peterson again. She posted that into the chat. I'm just reading it out loud. This was a fascinating talk, and I particularly loved the indictment of men spreading. I worry that there may be some incongruence with the meaning and use of the term intersectionality here. The way that it conceived in intersection is where several marginalized identities cross. Someone who is both a person of color and a woman, or someone who is both a woman and queer. Do you have examples of this interpretation of intersectionality in your research? For example, the experience of women citizens of Benin, or the differences in the treatment of rich versus poor Benin subjects?
It's a good question. In the historical documentation, I mean, if you say the women which appear, it's mostly the queen mothers. So that's, but I mean, you can see their attendance as well, and there is there is one case after 1897 in one of the sort of consequent sort of punitive expeditions, where actually does appear a sister of a local leader who sort of gets some kind of prominence. But still, I mean, it's you don't get that much of that, but and I don't think you will never ever get to this sort of ideal subaltern in some kinds, the ones who is suppressed in all sorts of ways. But that should, I guess, and this is maybe the work we have only sort of beginning in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, and when everyone starts digging, we will really find this, and we will, I don't know, in 10 years we get this exhibition, Plunder and Pajamas Suits, and then we will sort of bring up all this sort of Powis mother. I don't know, maybe we could, find out what happened to her as well. So, there is probably much more to dig out here, and so again, this very nonsense answer to the question, but I think there is potential to go further in these directions as well. And actually also, these are also things you can do with basically any collection, but I think the reason to do it with this loot is that it has such a, it is attractive for the audience in a way, so that's why, Anything else?
In any way, I think your insights, your scholarly insights should go back to exhibitions. And we as curators, it's interesting for us to have you and to also think about how actually we could practically integrate such critical representations. Yes. Are there more questions? Yes.
I'm a member of the Friends of the Museum in Berlin.
Yep.
And I would be very interested to hear how you judge the new exhibition in Berlin.
Oh, I've only seen it very briefly yesterday. So in the main, I don't know. After my first visit, I'm kind of happy, and if I had made another, I could also have included a slide from your first room in the exhibition, where where the original plan was to have, like in the British Museum, this display of all the plaques. And then, if you would have done that, I think it maybe would have been the same in the British Museum. You got this huge wall of plaques, and then maybe a little screen with something about restitution and looting. And as I've seen, when I'm sort of sit there in the British Museum and look at how people, they go and look at the plaques and then they go away. Only one person in 20 goes and sees that they are looted. So most people there miss this message about them, which maybe is the most important one. So I think, that you have done quite well here, but you are actually foregrounding this, the loot. And I mean, if I go to Hamburg, I mean, it's also, I mean, you can't miss it, this is loot. So I mean, that's sort of very much emphasized. So, yes, I'm kind of happy with exhibition here. Yeah. I think I will probably, when I sort of do a deeper analysis, I'll probably find something to complain about anyway. But yeah. So, but I don't know. So, but yeah, but I'm very happy with it. So yeah.
Okay, I think we have another question from the online room.
Yes, there is another question in the chat by Ms. Farmer-Palman of the Restitution Study Group. The impact of Black Lives Matter on the narrative that the British Museum was profound. Unfortunately, they did not have the full narrative on the Benin Bronzes. They lacked awareness that their own ancestors were enslaved in exchange for the bronze metal. Do you think that would have made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, that could. Yeah, I mean, they could. I mean, I guess the question was whether British Museum should have included that narrative. Yeah, and I think, yeah, why not? I mean, that would have been a very good idea, of course. And so, yeah, of course. And now when I'm sort of complaining about whatever museums do, I mean, I know that they do have very limited space, both physical and in terms of how much information you can put in the label. So, I mean, in a way, it's sort of easy to criticize museums for what they are not telling. I mean, but I mean, yeah, I mean, but what I mean, perfect. And I mean, the whole idea about whether you speak of someone else's culture or maybe you also address your own, because I'm always speaking about someone else's culture is a way of, I think, distancing it and I mean, what you don't speak about is what's normal and taken for granted, etc. So I think more of it sort of bringing our own cultures in and entanglements. The more you can do, the better. I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Are there more questions here?
Thank you. I have a question also. Now you talked a lot about representation inside the exhibition and besides physical objects. Yeah. But how do you have any ideas about how the different museums or also the British Museum use it in their advertisement, for example, or also in their digital space in their online collection? Because I was just thinking now we talked about the limitation of physical space, but in the online space you would have the room to explain in more detail or put more layers.
Yeah.
I have the feeling it's still not, also in the digital space, it's not so much different, but it would be interesting if or not, or how it's done.
I would say, I mean, if I begin with a museum in Benin City, I don't think they have a web page or anything. The British Museum, I would say basically the same information on the web page as in the exhibitions. I mean, they now have more. I mean, they do have this heading contested objects, which came up after Black Lives Matter, and then they go more into details. But I think, there is great potential to do much more on the internet with, and you can, here you can also play around with objects in a way. Zoom in on them and sort of the physicality sort of also changes on when you are online as well. So I think there is probably a lot of potential here, and which also reaches a worldwide audience in a different way. So so I think, as far as it's now, it's no difference really between what's online and in the exhibits, I would say, but there is great potential here, I think.
More questions? Yes,
Not sure that I have a question, but my wheels are sort of spinning in my head because I find it really interesting how the linearity with which we present objects, sort of that drive to present a very clear narrative in a museum and then to go from one object to another and from one display to another, is really kind of limiting when I think about it now. And I just wonder what will happen when these objects then finally get back to Nigeria, because from the festivals that I study, there tend to be sort of dispersed moments, dispersed over time, like nodes of cultural presentations, but they always have multiple meanings in layered sort of narratives. So it's just really exciting to see you explore these other avenues. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah, excellent comments. Yeah, we got, thanks for that. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and particularly the pajamas. And coming from kind of reeling off the question about how to introduce this kind of research into an exhibition, I wonder, isn't this kind of making the loot of the Benin Bronzes is this not going to make this about the colonialists again? Is this kind of appropriate to put this next to the bronzes, this story? Wouldn't that make relative the pain and suffering of the Benin people? I mean, I'm wondering. I'm not saying it would, because this is really interesting and it shows us something about ourselves and our society. But I wonder whether this would actually be the right place to put this in the Benin galleries. I mean, this could be in the Explorers Gallery somewhere else.
I think that's.
Thanks.
I think that's a good question, and I guess and also, I mean, dealing in a limited space, you have to choose what to present. But again, I mean, as many exhibits do, I mean, like here and in Hamburg, I mean, it's usually, say, 50% of the story is about what these objects were in Benin's society, and the other 50% about what they are meant in the post-1897 Western context. And I think that is a good way of going about it. I mean, and not only trying to explain this strange other, but I mean, that's. Then, of course, now, and as you might have noted, now I sort of zoomed in on Hamilton's pajamas and Powis' mother. But I think here, Powis' mother, I think that I got that in the records also made me think about, but the 124 native carriers, they also had relatives. So then I think you can go into whole that, and they are then. These carriers would then be from different ethnic groups in Nigeria, and some come from Sierra Leone, etc., etc. But so again, to sort of complicate, I mean, we tend to always get a little bit stuck in the sort of Western and African. But I mean, as Annie Coombs also talked about, I mean, this is so enmeshed in all sorts of, I mean, these categories are sometimes not very helpful, actually, when you want to say something, but but I'm sure, I mean, everything I say here can be misused very much for saying, well, let's focus on Hamilton's pajamas and not returning an object, and that's that's also a risk one can take.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I would close this panel now.
Thank you.
And I hand over to Maria. Thank you very much once again.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening.